everyone. This is John Daly here with my co-host Thomas D. Howes for another episode of the Reagan Caucus podcast. Our guest today is a retired Army Special Forces officer and a former director of operations at the Institute for the Study of War. You can read his written thoughts over at the Dispatch and now the Atlantic. His first piece there was published earlier this month. I'm talking about Mike Nelson. Mike, thanks for joining the two of us today on the Reagan Caucus podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great having you on. Mike, I wanted to begin by asking you about that piece of yours I mentioned in the Atlantic. It was titled, What Pete Hegseth Doesn't Understand About Soldiers, and it focused on the Defense Secretary's deep interest, or some would say fixation, on lethality and anti-wokeness within the military. Basically, the idea that our soldiers, and I'm probably simplifying this, but that our soldiers have been constrained from rising to a sufficient level of badassery on the battlefield. You argued a compelling point about professionalism, which included a powerful story from when you were deployed in Afghanistan back in 2014. Can you talk about that story a little bit? I'm sure it was just one of many, and also talk about how that story goes to your point that Secretary Hegseth gets the warrior culture thing wrong.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, in 2014, I was a company commander in 5th Special Forces Group. My company was deployed into northern Afghanistan, based out of Mazar-i-Sharif in Balkh province. At the time, we were in the middle of drawing down the U.S. footprint, or in the coalition footprint in general, from Operation Enduring Freedom, which had been the combat operations from 2001 on. To what was going to transition to become Operation Freedom Sentinel. It was the Obama administration signaling a change, that we were no longer in direct combat operations. We were just advising and assisting. We weren't going to be directly engaging the Taliban. We were just going to be assisting the Afghan partners doing it. And we would really withdraw our reach and operational reach across the country. By this time, we had kind of collapsed in the north down to just a single medevac ring. So at the time we were constrained, we had to operate in a place where we could get casualties into surgery within 1 hour. So you had to be basically 30 minutes time of flight, helicopter from the surgical site, pick you up, bring you back. So whatever that 30-minute range of that helicopter was, that was the limit of advance for your operations, which really constrained us. So that Kunduz province, which is the province next door to where we were based, fell outside of that medevac ring. The Taliban was really exploiting this drawdown from the Obama administration. They were increasing their presence and operations in Kunduz. It also just happened to be Ramadan, so they kind of took for granted that our Afghan commando counterparts, who were fasting as part of their religious obligation, wouldn't conduct combat operations against them. So we decided to prove them wrong. We picked up our whole footprint, including medevac capability, our own surgical teams, picked it up, moved it from Mazar-i-Sharif into Kunduz City, and used that as a base of operations for a week to do nightly raids across the province into these Taliban strongholds. On one of these raids, one of my operational detachment alphas, an ODA, a Special Forces team, landed with their Afghan counterparts on the LZ, and almost immediately upon landing came under fire from Taliban fighters, including a couple of machine gun teams. They had to react quickly. They had to defend themselves. They had to defeat the enemy. So they reacted with overwhelming lethal force. They killed several of the Taliban fighters. They defeated this threat. And along the way, they captured a wounded machine gunner, Taliban machine gunner. And at this point in time, my team leader on the ground calls me on the radio and says, tells me he's got a little bit of a problem, that his Afghan counterpart believes, number one, because he's so grievously wounded, and number two, because he is the enemy and was just trying to kill them, that they should just finish off this machine gunner, put him out of his misery in the best interpretation, and, dispatch him in the worst interpretation. And my team leader had to, point out to the Afghan lieutenant that this is not the way that professionals act, that he had to talk the lieutenant down. I had the same conversation with my counterpart, the battalion commander, who was already on board. He said, I understand this can't happen. And it was meant, I used this story to try to illustrate that a warrior ethos and a comfort with lethality and overwhelming violence is absolutely a requirement in any military or any successful military. You can't be skittish or squeamish about the nature of war and its true brutality. But when you have achieved that goal, it's not about just overwhelming violence. It's about controlled violence. It's about using violence to achieve a specific end. And when that end is achieved, then you can show humanity, mercy, professionalism, and compliance with the laws of armed conflict. I argue in the piece that Secretary Hegseth is so hyper-focused on what his very narrow view of lethality is, which is just soldiers doing killing stuff without any kind of constraint, or at least that's what it suggests, that it seems to be detached from this larger sense of professionalism, professional ethics, and the laws of armed conflict. And we have as a model for that, or as an example to look to, his role during the first Trump administration when he was just a media personality, where he lobbied the president to either pardon or commute 3 service members who were either convicted or accused of war crimes. And he successfully lobbied the president to do that. So in his view, it seems to be supporting the troops is never questioning the troops, even when they've exceeded what their expectations are in accordance with the laws of armed conflict.
Yeah, I suspect those efforts by Hegseth, and I could be wrong. I wonder if they made him stand out among other cable news weekend hosts, I guess, when Trump was choosing people for his cabinet, because it really does seem to align also with what we know about Trump's views on the military. As we found, if you believe John Kelly, which I do, and from other statements Trump has publicly made, the president doesn't really seem to understand that honorable part of being a soldier. He instead focuses on that killing machine part. And that's sort of your observation as well, Mike?
I do. I think it's part of an overall brand that Secretary Hegseth seems to have cultivated and developed as part of this persona he plays as, this warrior bro, for lack of a better way to put it. First of all, Secretary Hegseth, by all accounts, I have no reason to suspect that anything he did in his own service was anything other than honorable. He volunteered as a National Guardsman to augment an active duty unit during the war in Iraq, and then he volunteered for a second assignment as a staff trainer in Afghanistan. Neither of those should be. He did more than the average American did, and like I said, I have no reason to suspect that it was anything other than honorable service, and that he met the call of the country at the time that he did. But I'm going to go a little bit into some military culture. So he was not in the 101st Airborne Division. He was a National Guard lieutenant who volunteered to augment them, to go along as a singleton as part of this battalion. Now, that's great and well and good, but he's really made this his whole personality. He has a tattoo of the 187th Infantry Regiment, which is the Rakkasans, the brigade that he was attached to in the 101st. If you look, whenever, in addition to his commitment to what he refers to as the 3 flag rule, that he always wears the pocket square, the belt, and then the jacket liner, kind of over the top demonstrative patriotism. His lapel pin he always wears is from the Rakkasans, right? So he's made this kind of part-time gig a whole persona. Then you have the rest of the Crusader tattoos, and I've got plenty of crappy tattoos myself. I'm not one to judge, but it seems to be that he wants people to see him as this, as he referred to in his confirmation hearings. I'm the one with dust on my boots. I'm the true warrior, and you can see this from the social media presence he tends to cultivate as SecDef. A lot of secretaries of defense in the past, he likes to point out as though he's some anomaly. A lot of them in the past have done physical training with the troops. Mark Esper had a lot of pictures of just showing up to do PT with troops. Hegseth does it with units that he was never in but wants to be associated with. Did it with 1st Battalion 10th Special Forces Group in Germany. He did it with 75th Ranger Regiment at the D-Day Memorial, and he did it with the SEALs out in Hawaii. And he did it with Special Warfare Training Group down at Camp McCall, where Green Berets are trained. So he wants to be seen and associated with these very elite special operations units, which, in addition to, I think, it's part of his own image cultivation, how he sees himself and how he wants others to see him as a vet bro, for lack of a better way to put it. It also speaks to a very reductive view of who he is and what he represents. He's the Secretary of Defense, the entire DoD, the entire military and civilian apparatus behind that. he doesn't post pictures doing physical training with the you know, first COSCOM, which is a support unit, or with a bunch of basic trainees or anything like that. Like there's a whole part of the military that are not special operations or elite units that he's not doing this because that's not the image he wants. It's more about what he wants to be perceived as than showing support to the troops, I think.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something to that for sure. Images, of course, very important. I saw of a video the other day he put out on his Twitter account of the introducing some sort of drones where it seems so Hollywoodish. Like there's a lot of importance being placed on image there. But people should definitely check out the Atlantic piece. Very well written. Um, Definitely worth your time. I wanted to go ahead and bring Thomas into the conversation for some questions. Go ahead, Thomas.
Um, I'm sorry, I got distracted here. I had this question I wanted to give you, but now I feel like it's going to distract from that. You were going back to what you said about Hegseth, how he petitioned for the sort of the pardoning of these people who committed war crimes. Um, and that's a serious issue of accountability in the armed forces. Which not only is ethically problematic, it's also it creates problems long term as far as the effectiveness also of the military if we can't hold ourselves to professional or ethical standards. You're seeing what's happening sometimes. With the war in Ukraine, could you imagine if Ukraine was caught doing some of the things that Russia has been doing as far as targeting civilians, how that would impact the support for them internationally and all their war efforts, even on top of the ethical issue. So it's like bad tactics and bad ethics at the same time. I can see that. Um, I had a very specific question though that came out of this, and I hate to change the subject so quickly, but I would like to hear um, what when back to that time in about 2020 when Trump ordered the assassination of Soleimani.
Hmm.
I've heard from some people who were in the military around that time that questioned that move from a tactical standpoint, given because there's some people who were in Iraq saying that it caused serious problems for their ability to work with the pro-American factions in Iraq. Do you have anything to say about that? Would you have any thoughts about that debate? Or
Well, so I use an example in the Atlantic piece of sometimes you have to take into account larger strategic implications that might limit your tactical mobility or your tactical options. The example I use then it goes back to 2011 when Hamid Karzai was the president in Afghanistan, and he was demanding changes to our tactics, techniques, and procedures to raids at night and entering Afghan houses at night, and more forewarning and more coordination with Afghan locals. Now, it sacrificed some of our tactical surprise, but it maintained the strategic relationship with the local government.
mm-hmm.
I'd say the Trump administration decision to strike Soleimani represents kind of an opposite of that, where he made the strategic decision that killing Soleimani and limiting some of Iran's reach within their network by taking out this key leader who developed a lot of the network was of greater value than some of the short-term tactical operations that we wanted to potentially conduct with the Iraqis. Now, it obviously put us in a bad spot with the Iraqi government. They try to be. I'm not saying that they try to be all things to all people, but they recognize they have to maintain a relationship with Iran. The last time I was deployed to Iraq, in fact, we had the Iraqi counterterror. I was running a targeting cell that was targeting ISIS threat streams coming into Baghdad, and my primary counterpart that I worked with was the Iraqi counterterrorism Iraqi counterterrorism service, M2, their primary intelligence officer. And I was not part of this meeting, but I had to help coordinate a meeting with the then Secretary of Defense Carter, who was going to come and visit. Wait, do I have that? Yes, it was Secretary Carter. But he was coming in, and we had to deconflict because that same day they were going to host General Soleimani, right? And it was awkward, but we recognized they have a relationship with the Iranians and they have a relationship with us. We have to make sure that we don't have these two. There's no picture of Secretary Carter passing Soleimani in the hallway. So we looked at that to allow them to have that relationship. I think the Soleimani strike was a good indication of there are a lot of people who try to paint President Trump, I think, as an isolationist, and he's not. He's a conditional isolationist or a conditional internationalist, I guess. I don't think there is a overarching governing doctrine that guides his actions. It seems to be more impulsive and situational. But he has surrounded himself, Vice President Vance, Bridge Colby at USDP, Tulsi Gabbard at DNI, with people who do tend to be more isolationist or restrainer in terms of severing some of our traditional relationships, or at least harming them, withdrawing some of America's forward presence and influence around the world. But the president, as he's demonstrated with the strikes in Iran, as he's demonstrated with the strike on Soleimani, and as he just demonstrated a little bit with his, I think there's a lot of, we shouldn't read too much into it, but his recent announcement of selling additional Patriot missile systems to the Europeans to then pass on to the Ukrainians, I think he's demonstrated that he's willing to buck those isolationists within his administration, because he is ultimately the decision maker, and nobody knows his own mind besides him, quite frankly. If I could, going back to what you said, you queued it up with the pardons. One thing I'd like to point out is Secretary Hegseth likes to say that, I'm not going to question the war fighters. They're not going to be questioned by people in air-conditioned offices in the Pentagon. He's used that line several times. In the case specifically of Clint Lawrence and Eddie Gallagher, they were not accused by bureaucrats in air-conditioned offices. They were accused by their fellow war fighters. They were accused by their subordinates, by soldiers in those fighting formations, by the paratroopers that Clint Lawrence led, and by the SEALs in Alpha Platoon that Eddie Gallagher was the senior NCO for. These were people who had been through the same training, who were more on the pointy end of things, and said more maturely than their own leaders, this is unacceptable and we need to tell somebody about it. Not only does it undercut the premise that we expect people to stand up and speak out about unethical things, but in reality, Eddie Gallagher is now being celebrated by the president's allies, and he's gone on this tear trashing the SEALs who did the right thing. So they've paid a at least social or political or peer pressure cost, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, when he walked away with being feted by the MAGA influencer crowd.
Now, what was Hegseth's motivation there? Why did he do that?
So he's kind of, since coming out of Iraq when he was a platoon leader, I think he's created, part of his brand is he's a veteran advocate, right? And that was his whole role on Fox and Friends. That was his whole role in the books he's written. I am Mr. Veteran. I speak for, he's like the Lorax of veterans. I speak for the vets, which nobody should ever speak for the vets. I'd be the first one to say, I don't speak for the vets. I know people, I've had people that I served with who've reached out to me after the Atlantic article telling me they disagree with me entirely, right? We are not a monolith, and we should not be looked at that way. So no one can speak for us, myself included. But I think he likes to paint himself that way. So he was not alone. Former National Security Advisor, maybe next UN Ambassador Mike Waltz, was also campaigning primarily for Clint Lawrence, because he was working with an organization within his constituent. I can't remember which district in Florida he represented, but the St. Augustine district. But he worked with them to campaign to lobby the president to pardon Clint Lawrence. It was an interesting setup, because at the time that set up Mike Waltz being for the pardons against then Secretary of the Army Ryan McCarthy, who was against the pardons because it undercut good order and discipline, both kind of arguing in the president's ear, opposite sides. The interesting is they're college classmates. They were 3 years ahead of me at VMI, both of them. So these two guys who knew each other back when they were 21 years old were now finding themselves on opposite sides of a pretty major implication for what it says for what our national military is and what the United States is and what we stand for. Unfortunately, I think we made the wrong decision in each of those three cases.
Mm-hmm. Now, just continuing this discussion of since Hegseth, the one of I guess Donald Trump's political superpowers is he's able to change the news cycle so quickly that you forget about the last 7 or 8 things that happened. Now, when that Signal chat thing came out, I mean, it was hilarious. It was bad. But it was hilariously bad. Like it was just like something, from the military or the like Veep or something. I don't know. It was just so silly that somebody not only were they having the Signal chat to talk about the war plans, but somebody invited the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic in for an accident. I mean, and the fact that the people defending it can't even acknowledge how badly you messed that up. And that meanwhile Hegseth's on the Signal chat saying that operational security is 100%. How serious is that for somebody who's involved in the military and which is always going to be somebody but adjacent to intelligence and these issues of national security? How big of a faux pas was that?
Well, it was big. It was really big. I wrote a piece for the Dispatch a while ago that actually was the first thing I think I wrote for them that said part of the problem is these were supposed to be the grown-ups. These are supposed to be the ones who anticipate risk and advise the president on what risks are emerging, not just fall back on, well, this is what we've always done, or somebody said we're allowed to do it, right? The DNI, the CIA director, the National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense to a lesser extent are supposed to say, you know what, there are these tactical vulnerabilities in the way we've always done things, and we should adapt things to stay ahead of collection. People, a lot of the president's defenders, and again, the president actually was largely scot-free in that argument. I blame his subordinates in this case, or in that incident. But the president's defenders who saw any critique of the administration as a critique of the president himself would point out, oh, well, Signal's a secure app. That may very well be. I'm not a cybersecurity guy. I can't speak to the encryption capabilities of the Signal app. But the devices upon which Signal is loaded are not. Those are unsecured devices that can be infiltrated, that can have keyloggers, that can have other malware inserted on them. And those were their private cell phone numbers. I think Wired pulled up all of Mike Waltz's metadata that was available just on the scrapable on the web, including all his cell phone numbers. That means the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, various non-state actors could easily have known what his phone number was and used it and targeted it for phishing scams, for other ways to infiltrate that device, that specific handheld device that would have given them access to this. Now, Hegseth revealed some tactical level secure communications that he should not have. I primarily, though, blame Mike Waltz, whose job as the National Security Advisor was to provide collaboration, coordination, and the means for communication between the principals in the National Security Council, would include those secretaries and those DNI, for example, the means by which they communicate. That should happen at the NSC. That should happen in a SCIF. That should happen in a secure facility. Instead, for convenience, they did it on a commercial app on commercial phones. And I point out to a lot of people the specific timelines of strikes is classified, is inherently classified. Hegseth definitely revealed stuff that should not have been revealed on an unclassified device. But that is nowhere near as sensitive as the policy discussions, pre-decisional policy discussions about what the United States is going to do, and the fact that the vice president is openly disagreeing with decisions the president made. That is critical information for our adversaries, to know what the vice president's thinking and how his advisors may be siding with the president's policies and understanding our thinking. That's gold. That's the kind of stuff that they wanted to know. And what we don't know is how much of that was going on before Jeff Goldberg got invited in, right? If it weren't for Jeff Goldberg, none of us would have known this. And specifically Mike Waltz's own, fat-fingered incompetence. So we have to assume that because of ease, convenience, and laziness, a lot more was probably read in real time by the adversaries of the United States. Keeping stuff secure is inconvenient. You know, it's a pain in the ass to go and take your phone, lock it in the locker, go through the skiff, log into your TS account, get timed out of your TS account, have to go back in with your two-factor authentication, which is a different means. It's a timed device. It is a pain. It is an incredible pain. But you know what? I did it every day when I was at CENTCOM and when I was at SOCCENT, and everybody else who works in the IC or, you know, at places that have a skiff, they all have to do this. It's inconvenient. We did it for the CENTCOM commander when we were on the road. When he would have to travel to countries, we would have secure comms, and we took great precautions, and it was inconvenient. But that doesn't mean that you can just say, you know what, it's just too hard, so we're going to let the Iranians read this.
Mm-hmm.
Just real quick, if I could jump in, Thomas. There's a funny little side note on this. You guys might have heard this on, I think it was on the Dispatch podcast. I can't remember, but Jeffrey Goldberg was saying that he heard after the Signal controversy, there's always this joke about people confusing the different Goldbergs, Jonah Goldberg, Jeffrey Goldberg. I guess actor Jeff Goldblum was actually confused as being the person in the story who got brought into the Signal chat. He reached out to Jeffrey and told him this is crazy. But I just thought, can you imagine if that had actually happened though? Jeff Goldblum in that chat, that would have been fantastic.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. In theory, I mean, it just so happened to be Jeff Goldberg, but it could have, and that's the other problem. Do you know how you avoid adding people who aren't supposed to be on secure networks? You do it on secure devices because there's literally no physical means. You cannot add Jeff Goldberg or anyone else to a chat on JWICS, which is the top secret information system, right? You can only send it to people who have JWICS accounts, who are vetted and in this closed loop system. So all the arguments about, oh, it's okay because Signal's secure, obviously it's not. Because you have to look at security from a total system, including human failure.
Yeah.
Even if the encryption of that app is, and I've talked about the technical limitations of the devices upon which it's loaded, but even if that's secure, even if all the technical means are secure, the human decision and the human error is part of that total system. And a human error allowed someone into that network because they thought they were too smart for the rules that govern everybody else. Those rules are there for a reason. Mm-hmm. And not only are those rules there for a reason when you're not thinking things through, again, as I pointed out, these are the people who are supposed to think these things through, who are supposed to be anticipating not just what the rules are, but what the rules need to be because of the advances made by our adversaries and the threats that they present. Mm-hmm. It's funny you mention it, though, because I think when my Atlantic piece came out, someone on Twitter pointed out, you know, because I've written a bunch for the Dispatch and then I wrote for the Atlantic, and they said, Mike Nelson's doing the Goldberg tour. He's worked for Jonah Goldberg. He's worked for Jeff Goldberg. All he needs to do is work for Bernie Goldberg. And I was thinking, aha, well, I did show up on a podcast in his network. So I am doing
covered it all. You covered it all.
And then you got to go on the View with Whoopi Goldberg.
Right. Or the former pro wrestler. I need to.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, with the Signal chat thing. Okay, so coming to some more recent news, we had Kevin Carroll. I don't know if you know Kevin Carroll, but he's also written for the Dispatch. He used to be in the CIA and in the Army. On the show about 2 weeks before the bombings in Iran, and we were pretty. I mean, we had kind of, you know, in our conversation, we were like, you know, this might need to happen. Right. So we were sort of already predisposed towards bombing the nuclear facilities in Iran. Now, one of the things that the trade-offs that Kevin Carroll brought up was that it might be better let Israel do it, even if they don't have as good of means to do it, just because of the animosity it might create among Iranians, because they're very patriotic people, and it might actually strengthen the regime if America comes in and bombs something. So that's a real concern. But when they were having this bombing, you had the case of, predictably, the case of Tulsi Gabbard producing intelligence saying we don't think that they're near nuclear, you know, their capabilities. And I I'm not an expert in this, but I was very skeptical of their assessment, given the other information that I had seen. I think a lot of us are forming a holistic judgment about what Iran is up to, that that makes us skeptical of that sort of assessment. But Trump did something interesting. He says, "I don't care what Tulsi says; she's wrong." And she's the sort of director of national intelligence. Is it responsible? I mean, if he doesn't even trust Tulsi Gabbard in her position, which he probably shouldn't. Is it responsible to keep her there? What do you think about that? What should be done there? How much longer does Tulsi Gabbard have? Does he move her to some other position or?
So this is going to require a certain amount of interpretation and guessing about what's going on in the president's mind. And I think it's a mistake for anyone to claim that they know the president's thinking, especially somebody who's never met him. Right? But I think what the president has demonstrated is he favors trust-based relationships more than positional ones. What I mean by that is, and this has caused problems. You saw, for example, that Secretary of State / National Security Advisor / National Archivist Marco Rubio was negotiating with Venezuela at the same time that former ambassador to Germany, special envoy for cool stuff, and director of the Kennedy Center. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank on his name right now. But they were both negotiating, and it's because they both had the trust of the president, and they both thought that they had the remit to go do this. There was talk that if the president does move to fire Jerome Powell, that he will have, and I don't know if this is true, that he will have Secretary Bessent dual hat as the director of the Fed and Secretary of Treasury, which is just a positional incredible conflict of interest. But it's because he feels he doesn't worry about that. He doesn't look at an org chart. He thinks of who he can trust. So I think what we're seeing is, in that moment, he liked the fact that Tulsi Gabbard was a contrarian Democrat who went on and said and criticized her own party at the time and praised him as a kind of a maverick in her own right, and that's why she got the job. I don't think he necessarily cares one way or the other whether she's giving him good intel. I don't think he or she get intel from the traditional sources. I think a lot of she still seems to demonstrate a willingness to believe internet hype over what is being derived from her own analysts. We saw in the case that was made, the legal case that was made, that we can use certain old acts against Venezuelan immigrants because they are associated with Tren de Aragua. Tren de Aragua is a illegal invasion ordered by the Maduro government. That was the legal argument, and the intelligence community came out with an assessment that said, we see no association between the Maduro government and Tren de Aragua. They are a criminal organization not working under the auspices or the orders of the Venezuelan government. And Joe Kent, who came from 5th Special Forces Group, who's her chief of staff, I believe, right now, while he's waiting confirmation, and she said, thanks for your input, change this. We do see an association with the Venezuelan government. And so the intelligence matters less than what it supports. The belief is more important than the analysis. I think that's where she comes from things. I also think that's where the president comes from things. I think in this case, now I tend to agree that her interpretation or her analysis she presented in her testimony was half-baked and hopeful, taking the Iranians at their word. But I think in this case, what probably played out is the president believed Netanyahu and what he was presenting based on Israeli intelligence more than he believed what Gabbard was saying. I don't know that necessarily threatens her position from his point of view. I think in any traditional environment, the president saying, I don't believe the person I picked to give me advice would spark a resignation. I don't think she has the proper level of shame or professionalism, and I don't think the president looks at it that way. It's not a traditional administration, so I don't know that it necessarily harkens that she's threatened in any way, shape, or form. But it does show that, again, that he's willing to sideline people in any given conversation. It doesn't mean they're permanently sidelined. There's discussion. Again, it's anonymously sourced, but that in the lead up to Midnight Hammer, the president basically sidelined the SecDef and talked straight to General Kurilla, and just said, "I don't care what the SecDef thinks. I want to hear what Kurilla thinks," and that the SecDef wasn't even involved in the conversation. That doesn't mean that Hegseth is. I think that people fall in and out of favor depending on where they land. But it goes back to what we were saying earlier. The way to get back in favor is to put on a good show. Go down to Turning Point and talk about how woke the Biden administration was and how the president's the greatest leader ever, to probably spend a lot of hours of your limited SecDef time rehearsing and editing a video of you getting a memo from a drone, a memo that really doesn't do anything. It just says, "Hey, do better stuff." That's all his memos say. They don't actually create, they just say, "I encourage you to be better at stuff," as opposed to doing the hard work of creating new processes to establish these results that he wants.
Mm-hmm. So, since the news is constantly changing, but some of the more recent news that's most relevant is that Trump has, what started, I think, with the funeral of Pope Francis. Trump had a conversation with Zelensky that was very productive, that seemed to improve their relationship. Recently, Trump has turned, his relationship with Putin has soured somewhat. He's very, he says that Melania helped with that. Melania told him, that Putin was full of it because he was bombing a nursing home right after his phone call, talking about a ceasefire. I saw a report that Rubio and Kellogg had been pushing him in that direction for months behind the scenes. And there's clearly this conflict within the White House about Russia and Ukraine. Vance and Tulsi and probably Stephen Miller, because he's connected with Bannon. And I just assume he's on the bad side of most things, but I'm not sure about Stephen Miller. But the other ones, they have a very sort of Putin tanky, believe what Putin says. It's because of NATO expansion. JD Vance says, "I don't care what the hell happens to Ukraine," which is just awful. Like 3 years ago, they're a little bit more closely connected with people like Tucker Carlson, who also spreads sort of Russian propaganda on this matter. Clearly, there's a conflict within the administration on how to handle Ukraine. Trump seems to be erring towards the Rubios now of this. What about? And there's some reports about some sort of deal between Ukraine and the U.S. as well, because their drone technology is advanced and their use of drone in warfare is the most advanced it's been. And there's some sort of something that the U.S. military can gain from that, learning from them. In exchange, we'd give some sort of weapons. I haven't heard the full details on it. That's the other recent news. So this is all very promising for those of us who support Ukraine and want Ukraine to win this war. And we think that the best way for them to win this war is to arm them, get them strong, weaken Russia as much as we can to break Russia's hope and will. All that by saying, I'm so sorry, this is getting long. But Hegseth, back to Hegseth, where is he on all this? I mean, he's kind of played both sides of this with Ukraine. Is he one of the voices in favor of Ukraine? Is he valuable in that sense? I mean, we see that the biggest weakness in Hegseth is that his competence, right? Is that, would you say that's accurate? Is the biggest issue is competence?
So I think you have to divide people, some of the people in the administration, into true believers and this isn't exactly accurate, but opportunists, I guess, in terms of where they shift. You've mentioned, so Tucker Carlson, for whatever reason, is a true believer that he hates Ukraine. Mm-hmm. He said he does not care about Ukraine. He says he wants Russia to win. He said all kinds of horrible things. He's apologized for all sorts of Russian stuff. And that's just the slightest of, obviously, Tucker's recent change, or maybe it's his true colors, into some really abhorrent avenues. The vice president is a true believer in not liking Ukraine. And I think a lot of what blew up in that Oval Office meeting with Zelensky was the vice president's personal animosity towards Zelensky. If you go back and look, he's the one who kind of egged on the fight that then the president joined in because he didn't like where Zelensky was going. Mm-hmm. I think Tulsi Gabbard she's been an apologist for the Russians in the past. She's been an apologist for Assad when he was still in power. naturally will take the word of dictators and people who've demonstrated the worst possible behavior and then be skeptical over the West and the United States. And they always go back to, well, what about WMDs in Iraq? As though, that covers every sin that Assad and the Iranians and the Russians ever commit is because, our intelligence community got the call wrong on Saddam.
Yeah.
I think it's funny because the president, there does seem, again, I want to be very careful about not speaking for his mind, or what's in his mind. None of us can ever know what's in somebody else's mind, but he does seem to have this special place in his heart where the humanist and the compassionate argument is made to him by women close to him.
Mm-hmm.
When we first struck Assad in response to the use of chemical weapons, the reporting is it was Ivanka who said, look at what he's doing to Syrian children. And that moved the president more than a geostrategic reason. It was more a compassionate argument from his daughter saying, we can't let this happen to Syrian children who are being gassed. If the president's telling of the story, it was Melania pointing out what's being done to Ukrainian women and children in their cities on a nightly basis. I also think you can look at the president's behavior in that Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, as well as his recent frustration with Putin. A lot of his personal decision making, I think, seems to be less about a governing principle of he said he wants the war to end. That's the goal. He's less concerned about what the line is in the Donbass and what happens to Crimea. It's more about just ending the war. But he seems to be frustrated when people don't listen to him, or at least in his view that they should just naturally listen to whatever he says. He told Zelensky to make a deal, and he viewed it as though that's not what he was doing when he pushed back about whether we could trust Russians on a deal, and that's why he got frustrated with him in the Oval Office. He now has said, I keep telling Putin to stop this, and he's not. So I think a lot of it, where he sits on any given day. So we should be, it's good news that he's authorizing the sales of the Patriots and some of these other weapon systems that had been withheld by if reporting is believed, by decision of Bridge Colby. But I don't know that it's enduring. I don't think that it necessarily marks a massive shift that the president is wearing a Slava Ukrainian t-shirt anymore, or going to start doing that. I think it's right now he's frustrated that Putin is not listening to him, and that is more a symptom of his personal frustration than it is a marked shift in I am now all in on complete and total Ukrainian victory to include liberation of Crimea. I don't think that's where we are now. And this latest thing, another thing, it helped. There's this compromised position where he can go to his base and say, we're not providing money to Ukraine, we're selling weapons to Europeans. We're making money off these weapons. And then the Europeans can do with them what they want, which is pass them off to the Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually, if you don't mind, Thomas, I was going to ask you just a question related to that, Mike. I thought it was interesting. A few days ago, President Zelensky went on Newsmax, which I thought in itself was sort of notable, and said, he kind of made the statement that Biden cannot end the war, but Trump can. He basically, he was polite about it, pretty much, but he basically portrayed Biden as sort of, weak and insufficient, and Trump as strong and powerful. And I'm sure that rankled some Democrats, but I actually thought it was a brilliant move on Zelensky's part psychologically, because as you said, Trump is not grounded in this principle on these matters, but playing to his ego and framing him as superior to Joe Biden is exactly how you win over Donald Trump. But like you, I worry about the sustainability, the from this, because up until now, we're 6 months into the Trump administration. The moral, strategic, and geopolitical arguments for helping Ukraine hadn't made much of a difference to Trump. It was really his personal affection for Vladimir Putin was what mattered. I think what was driving his thoughts on this conflict. And yeah, I guess I was going to ask you about this, but you kind of said this already. It's you worry about the sustainability, and I worry about what if Putin now decides to butter up Trump with a lot of flattery, a new flattery offensive? Does that change things in the other direction? Is that all it would really take to sort of trim back some of the support we've been giving Ukraine?
I mean, I think there is always going to be the potential that, there again, I'm attributing this to others who have claimed this, but there's always the last person in the room symptom, right? That the last person to influence the conversation is the one that the president takes away that conversation. So I do think, I mean, we've seen it before where the president has a call with Putin, and then he seems to start echoing some of the Russian points of view about the nature of the war and how it started and where it needs to go to seek a peaceful resolution. I think the president is, he, at least in his statements, he started to say he has realized Putin doesn't actually want a peaceful resolution, or he's not signaling that. I think Putin's attempt was, flatter, pretend that there's some legitimate claim, some legitimate limited claim, and then continue along their goals, which are probably complete conquest of the Donbass. And then, you said removal of the Zelensky government. They really want a client state, a puppet state that they can control. And then most likely they'd pause and then restart total conquest towards controlling all of Ukraine. I think that, Zelensky has gotten much better since the Oval Office meeting in understanding the context of how you get what you want or how you communicate to the president. And some of that is indirect communications, going through Newsmax or Fox News or others who can put that platform in front of the president where he's receiving information. Obviously, Putin doesn't have that, but he does have the direct line, the phone call. You can see others are starting to mirror this behavior. A lot of people have mocked Secretary General Rutte from NATO for some of his very obsequious statements about the president recently. But I think that what you recognize is if you want to maintain a good relationship, you have to be a little bit kind of greasy in your praise. It has to come off a little gross. You see it at the beginning of cabinet meetings, right? Every cabinet meeting starts with the round the horn, tell President Trump why he's the greatest president ever. And that keeps people in the good graces. So whether that's a good thing or not, I think people have recognized that as an effective thing, at least for this current president. Tell him what he wants to hear about himself and then get to what you're asking. So.
I'll give it back to Thomas there. Go ahead, Thomas.
Well, if you ever see the movie Death of Stalin, if you watch it again now, it's like, oh my gosh, this is the first thing that comes to your mind is this is how Trump's cabinet behaves.
Well, also the willingness to switch on a dime. One of my favorite scenes is when Molotov's wife is released from prison, and she's around the corner, so Molotov doesn't know that she's there and has been released by Beria. So the last thing he knows is his wife's a traitor, right? And so he says something about like, oh no, she was a traitorous sow. And then she comes around the corner and he's like, oh honey, you're back. And it's like, okay, now she's okay. She's back in the good graces so we can switch sides.
Yeah.
The willing, whatever, and you see it a little bit, it's off topic, but you see it a little bit, like where not everybody's doing this, but is the Epstein case a big deal or not? And you see certain influencers be like, the president said it's not a big deal. I've been railing about it for 4 years. It's no longer a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's something else. And then, so I guess the last thing I wanted to mention was, or is the last thing? How much time we got here? Okay, yeah, it's probably the last thing. Talking about the Ukraine thing again. Now Giorgia Meloni, who I think is, from an outsider's perspective, don't know much about domestic Italian politics, but from an outsider's perspective, I think she's handled herself very well in the international sphere. She and Macron in France said that they are not interested in buying American weapons for Ukraine. They want to, buy European weapons for Ukraine. Now, there's clearly some self-interest from the standpoint of their countries that they want to use this as an opportunity to up their the industry, their sort of military industrial capacity for their own country. Sure, but I think there's like a non-selfish interpretation of that they have a point. What we've learned from Trump is U.S. isn't always that reliable. So Europe needs to become a little bit more self-reliant. What do you think about that? Is that a fair? Is that charitable interpretation, a fair interpretation, or?
So it somewhat relates to what the decision by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colby made to withdraw support, and his argument was We have so limited numbers of these weapons, we can't spare them for the fight in Taiwan.
Hmm.
And I think people who make those kinds of arguments, or who make the very, like, you should just buy our stuff because we're selling it to you now kind of arguments, don't realize the overall perception issue that is happening with the reputation of the United States.
Hmm.
Reliability and consistency matters far more than anything else. That we will continue to provide these weapons that and build an alliance of interoperability with our allies. Whereas we've signaled, in the last 6 months that maybe we'll stop sending them. Maybe we'll stop giving you the upgrades or the compatibility. Maybe we'll turn off the capabilities for some of these things if you don't do what we like. We actually did this in Ukraine briefly, where we shut off the targeting capabilities of the Gimlers, the GPS-guided multiple launch rocket systems, for a brief period of time. So if we're going to sell you weapons and then have the capability to turn them off or not provide the maintenance on them or the resupply of the actual munitions themselves for the weapon systems, then there is a certain amount of self-interested, like, the United States is not going to be reliable, or they're going to be reliable right up until they're not, and I can't plan around that kind of back and forth nature. The Chinese are going to be, I would argue, as they make their calculations about how to dominate the South Pacific and the South China Sea, they're not going to be looking so much at counting our number of Patriot weapon systems, our missile systems, and our Hellfires, and particularly not our AIM-7s, which are an outdated weapon that we have not hung from a U.S. aircraft in, I think, 20 years. But they are going to look at, do we believe the United States will commit and demonstrate resolve in countering our aggression?
Hmm.
And these kinds of decisions are going to influence both those countries that we consider partners and those countries that we consider adversaries. The partners will be less likely to trust us, and the adversaries will be less likely to believe our threats.
Yeah. No, that makes that, I tend to take that side. Do you think that the decisive action in Iran made Taiwan safer?
Yes, I think that it is not only in terms of the actual effects in Iran,
Hmm.
which are better than, it's more than a few weeks disruption than
Hmm.
some people were saying.
Yeah.
We can't take our eye off Iran. We still need to maintain presence and access to understand what they're doing with their nuclear program and trying to rebuild it. But you see Secretary Hegseth talking. So the world is on notice. Midnight Hammer happened, and no one's ever going to question us again. That's like saying no one would question us after Grenada. Grenada did demonstrate we were coming out of Vietnam, of the Vietnam malaise, but it was limited. And it continued to challenge us, in Panama, and then again, with the invasion of Kuwait. So I think Midnight Hammer did demonstrate we are willing to use force in places we might not have before, but it was a limited action. It didn't demonstrate that we're willing to commit force over a long, grinding conflict.
Hmm.
One of the things I point out now, I don't think our competition with China is likely to break out into overt major theater conflict.
Hmm.
I think it's likely going to take place in some of these gray space competitions. But if it does, in a naval fight, if the Chinese sink a U.S. aircraft carrier, they will kill as many sailors in an instant, or over the course of its sinking, almost as many sailors as soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines died over 20 years in the GWOT. That is a level of, I'm not sure Americans are ready for that. I'm not sure this administration has demonstrated the kind of commitment that says we will absorb those kind of casualties and continue to fight afterwards. So I don't think Midnight Hammer, which was a bloodless, in terms of American blood, bloodless operation, has demonstrated America is ready to fight a grinding conflict again.
Do you agree with our previous guest, Kevin Carroll, that it's imperative that the U.S. build up its ships because of the...
Absolutely. And this is a problem. So I've gotten into a couple of arguments in the past with several navalists that I admire, that the U.S. Army's budget should be gutted and sent to the Navy so they can build more ships. I argue we actually need both capabilities. We need to maintain our land fighting capabilities. But the Navy does need to spend more, to build more. And there is a failure of imagination on behalf of the naval leadership in terms of what they're going to do, how they're going to reinvent their service. The aircraft carrier was a revolution in military affairs in the 1940s. It was something brand new that changed naval conflict forever. what is the next thing? Because right now, the aircraft carrier is the base model for how we project power in a maritime environment. It's still essential, but if a aircraft carrier based F-35 having their end back range is less than a Chinese shore-based missile, we've already lost the fight. The Chinese can launch missiles at us all day, and eventually they're going to get through our Aegis missile defense systems and sink one of those carriers. So how are we going to fight them? Because we're not going to fight them off Midway Island in the middle of the deep blue ocean. We're going to fight them in the South China Sea, someplace within range of shore-based missiles. So what is if you look at going back to something you said earlier, if you look at what the Ukrainians did with Operation Spiderweb, they are leading the lethal laboratory. They are testing the new systems to compete with new technologies and bring, to use Secretary Hegseth's word, lethality in different ways. How does that translate to the naval environment? How does that do that so we can have distributed ships that are less susceptible to being mass casualty events, but still deliver those lethal effects across the same amount of range? And so I would encourage our sea services to, yes, we need to build more to be able to be ready to fight the Chinese and compete with the Chinese and just deter the Chinese. But we also need to innovate, and we need naval leaders who are saying what the next generation of Navy looks like, because it can't look like what it was in the 1940s and beyond.
Great. Well, we should probably, you've been very generous with your time, Mike. We appreciate you coming on. Very insightful. It always is when we talk to you. I want to thank you for coming on the Reagan Caucus podcast, and we'd love to have you on again sometime in the future.
It was a pleasure, and I'll talk to both of you soon, I'm sure.
Sounds great. And to everybody else, thanks for tuning in. If you watched today's episode on YouTube, as always, make sure you like the video and subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or some other audio platform, like and subscribe as well. And we will see you next time on the Reagan Caucus podcast.